Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural panel of the Hausa International Book and Arts Festival, the 2022 edition. This will be our first virtual panel. It's been 1 year already. We can't believe it, but here we are. And what's a way to begin but to discuss storytelling? Our panelists today will be discussing storytelling and disrupting the stereotype in Africa. I'm happy to introduce our panelists, Hadiza Ismail Rufai and Lerato Mogaalte for this panel. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello.
So, just for a bit of context, um, Binyavanga Wainana, the renowned writer, said, "One must treat Africa as if it were one country of 900 million people who are too busy starving and dying and warring and emigrating to read your book." This is the representation of Africa by Binyavanga Wainana in his satirical piece, How to Write About Africa. The idea of a single story itself is a Western tradition of describing Africa as it shows a people as one thing, only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. So, in this conversation, we would like to explore what possible solutions are there to the single story narrative of Africa. How do we equip and invest in alternative stories of Africa, especially through works of artists and cultural producers? What are the new and innovative ways of using storytelling to develop a positive narrative of Africa? I'll just give a brief bio of our panelists. I'll begin with Hadiza Ismail Rufai. She has an MA in creative writing from Bath Spa University in the UK. She's also the founder of Yasmin Rufai Foundation, which aims to awaken and nurture creativity in children and improve the literacy skills of disadvantaged young women in northern Nigeria. She's the wife to the current governor of Kaduna State, and she's the author of the novel An Abundance of Scorpions, which is her first novel. Welcome, Hadiza.
Thank you, Sada.
Our next panelist is Nerato Mogaalte, who is the content lead at Africa No Filter. She's a media professional with more than a decade of experience gained in various roles in publications that include City Press, Sunday Times, Drum, and Cosmos South Africa. She has also written for the Mail and Guardian, Sunday Independent, the Africa Report, and other leading publications in Africa. She has also worked at digital agencies with a portfolio of clients that included Facebook, Google, and Gel Effect Mobile. Welcome, Lerato.
Thank you.
So I'll just delve right into the panel itself. Um, I think I'll begin with you, with Lerato. Basically, it is not false to say that there's poverty, diseases, corruption, and conflicts on the continent. So why do we change the way we write about Africa if these things already exist?
Because that is not this, that has become the single story of Africa. It has become the defining story of Africa. And yet we also know that there is more to Africa than the stereotypes. I'll take it back to the work that Africa No Filter does. We started 2 years ago. We are shifting stereotypical narratives of Africa by investing in research, grant making, disruption, community building, and advocacy. We start with research because data informs our work and data allows us to really know where the gaps are and how we can best fill them. We did a literature review and found that over and over again, Africa is always framed in 5 ways. It's the story of poverty, the story of corruption, disease, poor leadership, and conflict. And that has become so prevailing of a narrative that oftentimes any story of Africa that's told, sometimes we found in other work that we analyzed that even in a story of arts and culture, a narrative of poverty, of corruption, of poor leadership still comes in, and that is the danger of it. The danger is that a continent that has 54 countries, over 1 billion people, more than 2,000 languages, has been lumped into a monolithic whole that is just dysfunctional, where we see Africans as lacking agencies and dependent on Western saviors.
Yeah, quite interesting. Just wanted to pick up on the grant and funding also, which I will talk about later. But also, when you mentioned the general narrative, so I would love to know your work at Africa No Filter. Is it just to counter these narratives, or also to unearth some different narratives that have not been heard before?
It's to unearth different narratives that have not been unearthed before. We look at how does Africa come up in the media, how does Africa come up in research, in pop culture, and so on. And what we do is really take the insights that we have and apply them to several of our work pillars, including grant making. And in our grant making, what we're doing is we partner with individual storytellers and organizations in arts, culture, and media sectors who are mission aligned, whose work shows Africa as a contemporary, innovative, creative continent.
Yeah, quite innovative, definitely. I'll ping back to you on the question that I'll be asking Hajia Hadiza. In that now I have two writers in my midst, because Lerato is also an author, a writer, as well as Hajia Hadiza Ismail Rufai. So I think for both of you, but starting with Hadiza, when did you realize in your life growing up in northern Nigeria, a northern Nigerian woman, that your calling is to write stories and to also now publish stories? When did you come to terms with that aspect of your life of being a writer and a publisher?
Thank you very much for that question, because I think for me, it's probably different from a lot of people, because when I was much, much younger, of course, I enjoyed literature in school, but Sada, you are aware that, well, you may be aware that in those days, nobody would encourage you to go into writing. Your parents would rather you take up professional courses like medicine, engineering, architecture. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I found myself studying architecture. And I used to read a lot. I enjoyed reading fiction especially. But somewhere along the line, as life happened, I stopped reading. Then in 2008, I had, I had a personal problem. My husband had to go on exile, and we moved to the United States of America. And then I said, okay, why don't I just take up reading again? And my love for reading was rekindled, and I thought about it that, well, let me try my hand at writing. So basically what I'm trying to say is, for me, it came rather late. I'm a rather late starter. But as they say, better late than never. So that's how in 2008, I took some online courses on creative writing, and that led me to even going to study masters in creative writing at the Bath Spa University in the UK. And I just realized that that's actually what I needed to have done all my life. I'm happy that I discovered that, however late it might have been. So right now, I think I'm particularly pleased. I'm doing exactly what I love to do, which is what I should have done in the beginning. But okay, no regrets, because every experience is good. In fact, everything I had done before starting to write and being a publisher will be a useful thing for me going forward. So I'm thankful for that. And recently I started a publishing company, Almara Publishing, because I want to encourage young people especially. I don't want a repeat of my experience. I want young people to enhance their creativity early enough, and for them to know that this is a path that they can follow, and it can be very rewarding.
Thank you very much. I think that's quite interesting. I'm quite fascinated, definitely, by your writing journey, in that it's the new narrative is atypical. It's not the usual way, in that you writers, African writers, mostly now, it's the young ones that have been targeted 20th, in the early 20s and 30s. So for you to have published your first novel at the time that you did, after almost done with your career, I think it's quite interesting in that it's a whole different narrative. So maybe just a follow-up question in that, now specifically on your writing, how do you think we can write about Africa specifically beyond stereotypes?
Yes, I think it's very important. That's why I want to say that the work that Lerato does is very, very, very important. For a long time, Africa has been depicted with a single story of poverty, corruption, misery. You know, we used to be called the Dark Continent, and that has been perpetuated by the stories that are told about us or that we tell about ourselves. But the world has grown beyond that. That's not to say that we don't have these problems. But let me tell you, even the Western world, they have issues. They have issues, but they do not dwell on that. There are so many other aspects. So we really need to bring out alternate stories about ourselves. And these days, you find that the young people like to read about science fiction, fantasy, comedy. There are also horror stories. There are so many genres that we can explore rather than keep on talking about misery and corruption and all the other issues that are associated with Africa. So I want our young people to explore certain different aspects. Like for instance, fantasy is now huge in the world, and you hardly find African writers going into that, or science fiction, or even doing graphic novels. There are so many aspects of our culture that we can depict in those forms, so that people will see that Africa is so much more than what has been known about it for a long time. There are so many good things happening in Africa. You can see, for instance, look at our music industry in Nigeria. It has blown all over the world. We have talented people, even in the tech sector. Nigerians are doing very well generally, not just Nigerians, other Africans as well are doing well. I think these are stories that need to be told. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Lerato, there's something she said that I pick up, and I think I'll ask before I piggyback to the next question. On these stories that exist, we understand that there are different stories, alternative stories that artists and writers and cultural producers have in Africa. But how do we equip, how do we invest in these alternative stories of Africa through works of artists and cultural producers?
There's two things that are really important that we have realized in our work in narrative, particularly storytelling that shifts stereotypical narratives. The first one is that, digital media has given us, the people, a lot of opportunity. It has put the pen back in our hands for us to tell those alternative stories of Africa. So you have TikTokers like Maroon Bulu, who has amassed more than 2 million followers and hundreds of millions of likes for a section on her profile that she calls Good News Sunday, and she profiles the stories of Africa that are missing, stories of innovation, stories of creativity, entrepreneurship. And that is really, really important because it puts the pen back in the hands of the people. We see, particularly through social media and digital media, that we can also be the ones who take up our own narratives and storytelling and start telling the stories of our communities beyond stereotypes. The second one is an investment that Africa No Filter did so that we can start crowding in a narrative of alternative stories of Africa. We did a research called How African Media Covers Africa. And the findings are what you would expect. We found that a third of all the news that African media writes about Africa is primarily sourced from Western outlets, so BBC, Agence Presse, and the like. And of course, they have a different news agenda for Africa. So what happens is that because African media gets stories from overseas and international titles, they then re-perpetuate the narrative of hard news, of disease, of poverty, of election violence, and so on. So we created an agency called Bird. Bird offers alternative stories of Africa. We call it content that connects the continent because we are giving each other the opportunity to see each other beyond stereotypes. We write about anything. For instance, there's a food blogger in Abidjan who is traveling around the country and parts of West Africa to show that Africa is a gastronomic destination, for example. So that's what we do with Bird. We are currently at COP27 as part of a partnership we have to write about the climate change and climate crisis through the lens of opportunity, of innovation, and of solutions. And I think that's what's particularly important. The one part that's needed is it takes a body of stories to form a narrative. Therefore, it takes a body of stories to shift the narrative. And there needs to be a platform for news, because news goes everywhere. It reaches places that you and I will not reach. And then additionally, there has to be and being able to empower and partner, and in our case fund content creators so that they are able to continue doing the work that they do that shines a different spotlight on Africa.
We can't hear you. I can't hear you.
You are on mute.
Yeah, I said that was quite interesting, quite fascinated, especially with the Bird News Agency. Just wanted you to shed more light on that. So, is it more of a news agency in that other news outlets from Africa could feed from the news that is being produced on that, different from what the Western press produces?
I was on mute. Yes, it is. We have about over 30 contributors in different African countries, and we have more than 50 media titles and media companies across the continent signed up to use Bird content. So what we do with Bird is that because we are a funder, what Bird has allowed us to do in the news landscape is be able to provide that alternative stories, because we can talk about narratives, but also there's the business of news, the business of stories, and that also impacts on what stories are told. The editors that we spoke with, that we interviewed, many of them said that they do not have the resources, even if they wanted to write more about other African countries, because there's just no resources, no capacity. So Bird works with contributors, and we work with media platforms who sign a memorandum of understanding, and then they use the content for free. So they do not pay for the content.
Yeah, that's quite innovative. And maybe just on the topic of innovation, also you mentioned in terms of funding and working with storytellers. Are there any storytellers or grantees that you could spotlight that are quite innovative or disruptive in terms of using storytelling to change narratives?
Absolutely. One of our grantees is Zikoko Media, is Zikoko Tech Cabal, Big Cabal Media. They own Zikoko and Tech Cabal. They did that road trip Jollof Road. So we partnered with them for a project that's going to take their archive and make it go live online. So it will be edited, it will go through the entire process, and then it will go online. And the reason we were so drawn to Zikoko is that it's disrupting what we know about news. It still tackles politics. It still talks about highly topical issues, but it is geared for a young audience. The language even is geared for a young audience. It's a very, social media language. It's very influenced by pop culture. So, it's disrupting because it still allows young people to be part of bigger conversations, but it is speaking to young people in a way that they find interesting. They see themselves in the news that they consume. We have Yasmin Fofana from Ivory Coast. As I mentioned, she's traveling in Ivory Coast on doing a series called A Taste of Ivory Coast, and she's profiling food from restaurants, conversations with restaurateurs, food bloggers, street food, and just really showing that Ivory Coast, and I believe she's also gone to Lagos and Dakar, so to show that these places are gastronomic destinations. You can think of Africa and food and not associate it with poverty and starving children. We have We have many great grantees that we work with. I suggest that everyone here goes to our website, www.africanofilter.org, and really get to see the body of work that we support, because I think oftentimes storytellers might not necessarily believe that they stand a chance of applying for an Africa No Filter grant, but we are a different grant maker. Like I said, we have a TikToker in our network, right? We have bloggers, we have vloggers, we funded through Kekere Storytellers Fund a Nigerian animator who was working on a book on African attire, so to educate African children about the attires and cultures from different parts of Africa. So the scope of what we fund and who we fund is really endless. The common thread in all of it is that it is shifting stereotypical narratives of Africa to show a continent that is progressive, contemporary, innovative, creative.
And definitely that's what we're here for. And
Yes.
that's why we celebrate entrepreneur storytellers even at the Hausa International Book and Arts Festival. Hajia Hadiza, just to talk about digital media, social media, you yourself, I think you bloomed late and became a social media influencer. I think the way you progressed almost to 100,000 Twitter followers at a point. When you were discussed, you started something called the Kaduna language class, in that it was a small community where you were teaching people. Maybe just tell us more about how that process was in terms of disrupting and using social media, where it is typical usually for the younger people to be the influencers, but you became an influencer within that community, with that niche in terms of teaching English and using English as a medium of instruction.
Thank you. Really, the way everything happened, I'm rather surprised because, I'm from what's our generation? Baby boomer. I'm a baby boomer.
Yeah.
So it's not natural for us to use social media. And even today, actually, apart from Twitter, I find it's really difficult or to use Instagram or Facebook. But for some reason, Twitter was, I think, something that I like to use. I started tweeting, because for a long time I've been worried about the deterioration in the use of English in our country, and I believe it has to do with the fact that the young people now tend to use short form because of they do digital things, like they are always on their iPad or the phone. There's no time to really write. They have short attention span, and therefore they have already coined certain ways of writing things, and that definitely affects their proper use of English. It's quite a worry to me, although I believe that sometimes we have to just go with the flow. But sometimes I think that in some years to come, maybe there will no longer be handwriting, because everything is typing, and people will be asking, oh, or maybe we can only see handwriting in the museums. So I started teaching English on Twitter, and it had a very good following because, surprisingly, the young people were interested to know what to do or to correct the common mistakes that are made in the use of English. And I tried to do it to put some humor into it. I think people relate to that when you make it interesting, not just like teaching, this is how you should do it, this is not the right way to do it, but you engage them with humor. And that's why the thing just blew. Actually, I have like 280,000 followers now on Twitter, and every day it's improving. So that's how the journey began, and we're still on it. On mute.
I think personally for me, what I found interesting with the classes is that it's not the usual way of learning English in school, because I know difficulty of learning English in school is about beating, it's about not speaking, because if you speak it wrongly, it's a problem. But using storytelling and humor in the Nigerian context. Even reading the book Kaduna language class, which you compiled, you could see from the graphics, it's everyday way we use English here in Nigeria. So it's the way you Nigerianized or Africanized the English, in that English is now our language and no longer a foreign language. So I think it was quite interesting. But also I think you also did some on Hausa language as well, not just English, but I think sometimes you went into Hausa language in terms of how people spell, in that people find it difficult to write or speak. Maybe you could give us more also on the difference on teaching English as well as Hausa on the Twitter cycle.
Yes, I think that's very important as well. I believe that, we have to take care of our indigenous languages as well. But because, of course, we are colonized and English is the official language. By the way, I'm not criticizing that. I always say that the only good thing about colonialism, I think, was the fact that it brought us English. Because in Nigeria, as you know, Sada, we have close to 500 indigenous languages, and these are not dialects. These are languages that are completely different from one another. And I often wonder, if we didn't have English, how would we communicate as a country? So that is a good thing, I think. But having said that, it's also important for us to make sure that our own languages do not die off. In particular, I think a lot of us speak our indigenous languages, but when it comes to writing the language, there are so many lapses that I find. And I think those that are interested in Hausa language have to have some kind of conference so that certain things can be standardized. But I don't know how that is going to be. I think it's people like Professor Ibrahim Malufashi that should do that, those that are particularly interested in the Hausa language in particular. As this is a Hausa festival, I think this is one of the things that should be discussed. It's very important for us to sit down, standardize the language, the grammar, and so that when people write, they can write the language properly.
Yeah. Thank you so much on that. Definitely, I think it's quite important to be able to have a proper standard way of writing, because I think that's one of the issues, in that we speak the language, but in terms of writing it, sometimes we don't even understand what's been written. So I think that's something definitely that we started discussing at last year's edition of the Hausa International Book and Arts Festival, and something I think that's already in the pipeline and hopefully will be discussed on site at the festival on the 1st and 2nd of December. I would love to jump into writing as well as travel within Africa, within Nigeria. I know Lara will be in Nigeria, or will have been in Nigeria and will have experienced Lagos and hopefully other parts of the city. So I would love to start with Hajia Hadiza. Most of the time, Africans don't know a lot about other African countries, which is quite disappointing. But in Nigeria, you mentioned it earlier, even Nigerians don't know so much about other Nigerian cities and towns. So in your own work as a publisher, in your writings, how do you tell these complete stories of your own part of Nigeria that other Nigerians or other Africans do not know so much about?
Yes, I have to agree with you, Sada, that we Africans don't travel as much within Africa as we should. Many of us would have traveled to the UK, America, part of Europe, but within our own country, you find that we don't really travel as much. And I think that's a pity. Although I know there are practical issues, because it's easier to fly to the UK than for one to go to certain countries in Africa because of the way the airlines work. But I think it's very important that we do travel. You find that many Nigerians have not even traveled to other countries in West Africa, which is a pity. But talking about Nigeria now, I always say that it's important for us to expose all the cultures that are available in Nigeria. You know, Nigeria is a country. Yes, the country was amalgamated by the colonial masters, not based on anything, based on their own interests and how they can exploit the resources that we have. It's not about us. So when they came to mark out the countries, they did not care about putting people with similar culture in the same country. I mean, they just marked it the way they wanted. So basically what I'm trying to say is the culture in the southern part of Nigeria is completely different from the northern part of Nigeria. And even when I say the southern, the east and the western part of the south have completely different cultures. Now, what I find is that many stories out of Nigeria are told from the perspective of the South. That is because we've had more writers from the South, and they write these stories from their own perspective. In the northern part of Nigeria, the northern part of Nigeria was heavily influenced by the Arabs and by the religion of Islam. So you find that the culture, even our language, Sada will know that the Hausa language, many of the words were derived from the Arabic language. So there's that heavy influence in the culture, of course, the religion. But it seems when you're talking about Nigeria globally, nobody seems to know that. You know about the Igbo culture, maybe the Yoruba culture, but nobody knows about the culture in the North. And that is one of the reasons why I started Almara Publishers. I want to encourage our own people to write. It's not just Northerners to write, but anybody that wants to write the Northern story, we will encourage, because we want that story out to the world also. It's always good when you know more about different cultures, because then I think you become a more well-rounded person. So, and also because of the topic we're discussing now, the issue of trying to improve on the stories told about Africa, not to keep talking about a single story about the misery and all the bad things that come from the dark continent, as they used to say. I think with Almara now, we should focus more on stories that are different. Of course, if we get, like when we ask for submissions, we'll now consciously be looking out for stories that are different, stories that are not too heavy on themes, on the heavy themes, just to encourage different stories to come out. That's not to say that if we get a story that's heavy, that's about a heavy theme and is good, we will not take it up. But I think particularly we'll start deliberately looking out for stories that are different. It's very important.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think also to just look at ordinary story, because I think most of the time what we find as writers from Africa is that publishers from the West are always looking for thematic preoccupied stories, but we sometimes just want to tell ordinary stories about a goat that is roaming around in our streets. So that's also, I think, quite important to have from that
Yeah.
perspective. Lara, to jump onto you now, specifically around travel writing and traveling across Africa. I would love to know what your experience has been of traveling across Africa for someone that does travel writing, and your experiences of different countries. For example, what your experience will have been of Nigeria. Is it when you travel to a single part of Nigeria? For example, someone that goes to Abuja, to Lagos only, will have a completely different opinion of Nigeria from someone that went to Borno, for instance. So how have you been able to navigate all of this in terms of storytelling and disrupting narratives?
What was really important for my travel writing is that when it initially started, I've been doing it for more than 10 years now, but when it initially started, it was after a 4-day media trip to Accra, and I was blown away. I was blown away because the Accra I was experiencing was not the Accra that I had read about in the news. And I just thought to myself over those 4 days, I need to travel Africa. My dream to travel Africa needs to be realized. And less than a year later, I resigned from my job, quit my life in South Africa, and started traveling. I went to Senegal first. I ended up traveling for 5 years full time. So I had a lot of time using public transport, going to cities, villages, and towns, experiencing urban culture, experiencing heritage, art, music, cuisine, everything. And the biggest takeaway for me as a storyteller is that truly Africa is not monolithic. You know, even how even the character of a city is not the same. The character of Lagos in Victoria Island is not the same as the character of Lagos in Ikeja, for instance, right? So that is really very important. And another thing that I realized as well is that the danger of telling a story from a single narrative, particularly with travel, is that it limits the imagination. You end up not knowing the continent or the country that you're reading about. I wanted to be a travel writer because I love traveling, and every single literature that I read about Africa was not the Africa that I wanted to see. It was not the Africa that was calling me by name. And that really showed me that as writers we have to be conscious of bias. We have to be conscious of the impact of words and the impact of narrative, and how they can either be harmful or they can illuminate something that we haven't previously known about a place. And secondly, really understanding that Africa is still defined the experience of Africa is still defined through stereotypes. When I told a lot of my friends that I was traveling, the first thing they said was, "Oh my goodness, what are you going to eat?" Right? Um, and when you think about West Africa, I mean, as a generalization, West Africa is obsessed with food. West Africa is obsessed with clothes, right? Like West Africans will outdress you. West Africans will outcater you, will feed you, and all of that, right? And I never knew that food is so nuanced, that the way it is prepared in or even eaten in one part of the continent won't be how it's eaten elsewhere. Take, for example, in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, they eat injera. It's a sourdough bread that's like a spongy, and they put toppings on it. They put meat, different vegetables, and so on, and everyone eats together from the same plate. But there's a layer of intimacy that's added. Oftentimes when you're eating with someone, and it's your beloved, maybe it's a guest, maybe it's a friend you haven't seen in a long time, you feed them from your hand to theirs. And I found that so beautiful, just the intimacy, that love, that tenderness of someone lovingly dipping their hand into a plate, and instead of going to their mouth, it came to mine. And I think that's the beauty of travel writing, is that it allows us to tell these little stories, these details that seem so random and yet tell so much. And it also allows us to really do what news media, for instance, doesn't do, which is, like you said, tell the story of a goat, tell the story of anything. It doesn't have to be thematic. It doesn't have to unpack issues all the time. It doesn't even need to find a solution. It can just be an African story, and the purpose of it is to simply make the reader laugh.
Lovely, lovely, Larissa. Now you've made me want to travel to Ethiopia.
It's beautiful. There's a place in Addis Ababa called Arat Kilo. It's a neighborhood. At around 5 p.m. every day, it smells like a spice that they use to cook. It's called berbere. It has 13 herbs and spices, and they roast it. So if you go to Arat Kilo in the afternoon, it just smells like it. And the reason I love talking about Ethiopia and food is because the story of Ethiopian food is always associated with hunger, is always associated with malnutrition.
Quite true, quite true. I think traveling within Africa, I think, is one important piece of dispelling stereotypes and especially writing about it. I'm still, Larry, interested to know what has been people's reception when they read your stories or when they listen, because right now, just listening to you are an amazing storyteller. Just listening to you transports me to these places. What has been people's reception to reading your travel stories?
Someone sent me a message on Twitter today to say that they're in Cairo and they had a copy of Vagabond with them that they took a picture of for me to see because it's one of the places I write about. And the response has been phenomenal. People have been inspired to travel. People have been inspired to think differently about the continent. People have been inspired to even reconsider how they travel. So the way that we all have different ways of traveling, but my way of traveling is to always say, arrive as a blank slate and let life happen to you. Befriend people around you, eat what everyone is eating, there's this fear of drinking water. It's like, oh, you cannot have drinking water from a tap. And I'm like, but guys, look, if I look around me and everyone has been drinking this water and they are not sick, the water is safe to drink. Water is only unsafe to drink when there's a cholera outbreak, right? So just little things like that have really been very important. People were able to see that you can be a woman and travel alone in Africa and have a very, very safe and secure experience. People were able to see that, sometimes we put limitations on what it takes to travel. You don't need to have a language in common because as people, 70% of our communication is body language, but above and beyond that, as people, we have other languages that's not necessarily using words. We have the language of hunger, we all want to eat, the language of hope. Someone can see when I'm frustrated and they want to soothe me, someone can see when I'm happy and they want to celebrate with me, and so on.
Amazing. Ajay, these are just we want to also talk about your book, An Abundance of Scorpions. Specifically, I think it was the first time for us, maybe for the first time in a very long while, where we could relate to a character that has a typical Northern Nigerian. A lot of people I know relate to Tambaya just because of the name. I can remember the song that Jeremy Gang, a musician, basically developed a song around the character on her book called Tambaya, which is a very typical Northern Nigerian name. So just also around the reception around your book, how have people related to you about the book? And also tell us about the process of translation. I know you're in Sharjah now because the book is being translated to Arabic. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. First of all, I specifically chose that name Tambaya because, like I said earlier, we have a heavy influence of Arab and the Islamic culture. So much so that our indigenous Hausa names are all but gone. You and I, Sada, we bear names that are basically Arabic names, right?
Not myself. I think I have a Hausa name.
Sada?
Yes.
Well, Hadiza. Well, I'd like to claim that Hadiza is a Hausa name too, but you know that it came from Khadija, which is
an Arabic name, yes.
So you find in northern Nigeria, everyone is called Aisha, Halima, Mohammed, Abdullah, So I just wanted an authentic Hausa name for my character because we used to bear such names. The reception for the book, I think, has been very good. Like I said, we don't have so many stories coming out of northern Nigeria. And this is a story about a typical northern Nigerian Muslim woman. I don't know of any other novel that has had a protagonist from that cultural background. So I think people appreciate that. I think there should be more of such stories coming from northern Nigeria. So what was the other, old age? You have to remind me.
Yeah, but I think you basically answered the question, but just also to drag everyone, I was also talking about the translation of the book into Arabic.
Yes, that's it. It's so exciting. I'm so excited that my book has been translated to Arabic. Yesterday I got a hold of it and it was so exciting. The only thing is I felt, I wish I could read it. But I can't, unfortunately. So actually my publishers handled everything. They collaborated with a publisher here in the UAE that got the book translated. And I have to say it's such a wonderful feeling, really, to get hold of my own book in Arabic. So now I think the next translation I'd like to have is French. Yes, because
Yeah,
at least
I
that's
think
what
that's important,
I
especially that we are surrounded by French-speaking countries.
in
And I think
West
it's one thing
Africa,
to always
exactly.
find. Yes, we can't
Yes,
read each other. We don't even understand each other. I think it's
exactly.
quite important. Just to add on that, I think we, at the current edition of the Hausa International Book and Arts Festival on site, we'll be having Hausa French-speaking writers from Niger Republic, which is just
Mm,
a stone throw away of Nigeria. But there's never been that interaction between these two countries just because of the colonial language barrier. So
that
I think
would-
it's
yeah.
quite important to have that relationship and interaction back again. Leratu, in terms of funding and storytelling, how does your work at African No Filter prioritize diverse networks of artists, cultural producers, and decision makers through your funding? How do you look for that diversity? Because most of the time when you talk about writing, literature, you see Nigerians dominating the conversation in terms of also the music and entertainment. So how do you get those diverse stories? Not even in Nigeria, getting I can see from most of your guarantees that quite different in that it's not the usual kind of stuff that we see from the Nigerian scene.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you noticed that about our portfolio of grantees, because that's what we're aiming for. We know, to us, Africa is not one country, and Africa is not Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. So we're very intentional about being accessible. We do this in several ways. This includes whenever we have grant call outs and grant applications, we accept applications in French, in Portuguese, in Arabic, in English. We translate the content into that language. And because some people are better speakers than they are writers, which then, if they have to send a written application, might disadvantage them, we also accept, for some programs, applications that are recorded. And we also, before we do a grants call out, we also go to the community. We have focus groups. We speak to creators. We speak to industry to identify gaps, right? And so that informs our grant. We the latest grant call out that we had, it has now closed, unfortunately, is called the Last Mile Film Fund, and it's going to fund films in the last three stages of post-production. This came about because we know that film is a very influential medium for storytelling. It really, everything we know about America comes from movies.
Yes.
If you put me in downtown Los Angeles now, I'll know where to go, not because I'm interested, but because I have consumed it in so many movies that I've almost internalized it. So with that power of movies, we wanted to fund African movies. So we spoke to filmmakers, and the filmmakers that we spoke to, and the focus group said the biggest challenge in creating is actually funding post-production. That's why we created the last mile and identified post-production as what we will fund. And we do the same with every time we have a grant call out that's about to go out, we sit together as a team. We ask each other questions about it. What's missing? What more can we get? Is it easy? Is it accessible for everyone? Because access is different. Access to someone who is in an urban part of Africa is not going to be the same as access to someone in a rural part of Africa. So in fact, because of that, we even have a partnership with Western Union for our Kekere Storytellers Fund, so that when people apply, they can still access money without necessarily having to be in an urban center, without needing to have different types of banking facilities available to them. And that's very important because, number one, really our aim is to decolonize grant making. Number two, it is important to reflect the diversity of Africa in our storytelling as well, in the storytellers that we fund, in the organizations that we fund. And it's also important that no one is left behind in our storytelling. When we started, opened our initial grant funding season in 2020, we had a lot more applications from men than we did from women. So for a different grant call out, the next media grant call out that we had, we said, hey, why not just make it only for women? And so we made it only for women because we know that we received a lot more applications from men than women, but also we know from research that women are underrepresented in the media, both as the subject of the topics that you're reading and as the creators of the stories. So we really find ways. We are nimble, nothing is set on stone. We move with our times, we always assess our work, we always look at learning points, and most importantly, we look at insights that we can apply the next time to ensure that when everything is said and done, when you reflect on the work and impact that Africa No Filter does, you see 54 countries, you see all these different and alternative narratives that we are advocating for.
Wow, wow. Thank you so much, Loretta. I think that's a very insightful analysis of how diversity should work in real life, not just based on our thought of what diversity is, but by navigating and learning in the process. We're basically 15 minutes on the clock. It's very nice when talking. I think I almost forgot that we had a time limit to this. So maybe I'll just ask one final round of questions for both of you. We've talked about the single stories in terms of the wisdom perspective, but also how do you advise, what do you recommend for us within Africa in terms of single stories of different other parts of Africa? How do we challenge, how do we change that single story of what I know about South Africa, of what I know about Kenya, and how do we learn about other African countries? So maybe as a final round of questions, I'll begin with Hajia Hadiza and then Laratu.
Well, it's really very important, and I think the best way, or one of the best ways to do that, is to get out more writings and also use, like Leratu said, the film is very powerful in changing narratives. So we need to work more on that, not just between countries in Africa, but also within countries. Like in Nigeria, we also have this problem of single stories when it comes to different cultures within the country. You find that generally many people tend to think that people from the northern part of the country are like this. People from the east are like this. People from the west are like this. But when you get to meet people and interact with them, you find that it is not so. But not every person has the wherewithal to travel and interact. If you cannot travel, I think the next best way of getting to know people is by reading books or watching films, such that you reduce that fear of the other. I think a lot of the problems we have, specifically in Nigeria, is because of this fear we have of the other, thinking that the other person is different from us. And the only way that can be reduced is by interaction, either physically or by reading stories about that culture. At the end of the day, you find that basically we all want the same thing. Basically, we want progress, we want safety, we want to have a good future for our children and our grandchildren. It's very important.
Thank you very much. Final thoughts, Lerato?
It's very important for us to take back the pen and put it in our hands, until the lion learns to ride and tells their own story. The story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. There's wisdom in that. And it's very important for us to take back the pen. It happens in different ways. As a journalist, I can take back the pen by writing alternative stories about business in Africa. I can profile innovators in Nigeria fintech industry, for example, and tech space. As an individual with a phone, even if it's a feature phone, who's on social media, I can just go out. I live in Africa. I can just me going out to do my shopping and recording it and showing you what's around me, and you're seeing my city differently. That's taking back the pen. I'll go back to film, for instance, and mention Netflix, right? Netflix is doing work with producers in Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, and they have movies from these countries. And what I love about them is that I call it the big Netflix opening shot. They are shooting African cities as glamorous, as aspirational, as developed, as cosmopolitan. You want to be there. You want to be there. And that's what I love, right? Our cell phones and social media allows us to also create those Netflix moments for our cities. Ultimately, this is what this the reason we should all be invested in narrative is that this narrative is the negative, the stereotypical narrative is harmful, and it does not reflect who we are. And secondly, it speaks for you anyway. By virtue, this is how I reason, by virtue of being an African woman, when I walk into a room, people might have certain assumptions about me. They might assume that I do not have agency. They might assume that perhaps I'm not educated. They might assume that I live with certain cultural and religious pressures just because of that, right? So this narrative speaks for me whether I'm there or not, whether I'm invested in it or not. So it's important for me to take back the pen, because ultimately the version of Africans that we need to see in the media has to be one that better represents us.
Thank you so much. I think that's a powerful way to end this session. Thank you once again for joining us at the second edition of the Hausa International Book and Arts Festival. Thank you, Larato, for joining this conversation. Thank you, Hajia Hadiza Ismail Rufai, for giving us your last 1 hour. Join us in Kaduna at Arewa House on the 1st and 2nd of December 2022 for the on-site version of the Hausa International Book and Arts Festival. It's bye from me. Thank you.